The heavy wooden doors of the Westwood County Courthouse creaked open as spectators shuffled inside, murmuring among themselves. The air carried an undeniable weight of anticipation. The kind that made even the most seasoned courtgoers sit up a little straighter. At the center of it all stood a teenager. Hands in his pockets. Eyes calm. As if he wasn't the one on trial for grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Nate Carter. 19 years old. Had the lean frame of someone who hadn't quite grown into his full stature yet. But his posture told a different story. He didn't slouch like most defendants who walked into Judge Albert Monroe's courtroom. He didn't avert his gaze or shuffle his feet. He stood firm. His chin slightly lifted. As if he already knew how this would end. Judge Monroe. A man whose career had been built on efficiency rather than justice. Exhaled loudly as he flipped through Nate's case file. His reputation for quick trials and sharp tongue was well known. In his mind, this was another routine case, a reckless kid who thought he was too smart for his own good. You think you're some kind of legal prodigy? Ha! Monroe drawled, adjusting his glasses and peering down at Nate from his elevated bench. His tone dripped with amusement. As if he were watching a child play dress-up. This isn't a classroom debate, son. It's real life. You're in deep. The chuckles in the courtroom were immediate, low. Smug laughs, from the bailiff, the stenographer, and even the prosecutor. Cameron Reeves, who wore an expensive suit and a smirk to match. He had prosecuted dozens of cases like this. To him, the outcome was already set in stone. But Nate didn't flinch. He didn't crack a smile. He had spent too many years preparing for this moment. Not this exact scenario, he had never planned on being a defendant, but he knew the rules of the game better than anyone in that room. While other kids memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he played mock trials in his head. Constructing arguments. Deconstructing testimonies. His mother, Evelyn Carter, had been a paralegal for over 20 years. And their dinner conversations had always revolved around justice, or the lack of it. He had grown up hearing about corrupt prosecutors, lazy defense attorneys, and judges who cared more about their schedules than the truth. And now, he was standing before one. Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple as he glanced at the clock. Let's make this quick. Shall we? I've got a golf game at 2. More laughter rippled through the courtroom. But this time, Nate allowed himself the faintest smirk. The judge had just made his first mistake. Reeves stood, adjusting his tie before stepping toward the jury box. His voice was steady, confident, the voice of a man who had done this 100 times before and expected no surprises. Ladies and gentlemen, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Nate Carter, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2023 Tesla Model S reported missing just hours before his arrest, Reeves said. Pacing with deliberate ease, officers pursued him through downtown, where he attempted to evade them before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. He turned to face Nate directly. The evidence speaks for itself. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. It sounded damning. A stolen car. A chase. Fingerprints. Judge Monroe leaned forward, his chin resting on his hand. Sounds pretty straightforward to me. Nate remained silent, his hands still in his pockets. He had spent years studying cases like this, watching how prosecutors crafted airtight narratives. But he had also learned something else: no case was truly airtight. There were always cracks. You just had to know where to look. Reeves continued, flipping through a stack of neatly arranged papers. The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding. That Mr. Carter is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance. He glanced at Nate before turning back to the jury. But let's be honest. What kind of innocent man runs from the police? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Monroe nodded, tapping his gavel lightly against the desk. All right. Let's hear the defense's response. He turned to Lisa Thornton, Nate's assigned public defender, who had barely spoken since the trial began. She hesitated, then stood, shifting nervously. Your Honor. My client, Nate placed a gentle hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Nate spoke. I'll be representing myself. Your Honor. A hush fell over the courtroom. Monroe stared at him, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. You'll what? Nate's voice remained steady. I'll be defending myself. The prosecutor's smirk widened. The bailiff raised an eyebrow. The judge looked thoroughly entertained. Reeves chuckled under his breath. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Nate took his first step forward. Because everything was about to change. He let the silence stretch. Just long enough to make them uncomfortable. It was a strategy he had observed in real trials. Timing mattered more than words sometimes. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled. Before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Reeves raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. Go ahead. Nate took a slow step forward. You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested. Correct? Reeves exhaled sharply. Already bored. That's right. And that testimony is written in his official report. Of course it is. Nate nodded. Then turned to Judge Monroe. Your Honor. I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Monroe squinted at him. On what grounds? For the first time, Nate pulled his hands from his pockets, gesturing toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. The first ripple of confusion passed through the courtroom. In fact, Nate continued, stepping closer. He wasn't even on duty when the chase began. Reeves frowned. What are you talking about? Nate turned back to the judge. Your Honor. If the court allows, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report states he witnessed me in the vehicle, then his location history should match. But he let the sentence trail off, letting the implication sink in. I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Judge Monroe glanced toward Reeves. The prosecutor hesitated, a second too long. And that was all Nate needed. Judge Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple. Counselor? Reeves cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. His earlier confidence had taken a hit. Your Honor. That report was filed by an officer of the law. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Nate gave a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't? He let the words hang. Judge Monroe studied him for a long moment. Then he turned to Reeves. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? The room was silent. The jury was watching. The gallery was watching. And most importantly, The judge was watching. Reeves hesitated. Then, finally, he shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But the shift had already begun. For the first time since the trial started, the courtroom wasn't laughing. The courtroom was silent. And the tension was loud. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. The kind that made even the most confident men hesitate before speaking. The gallery, once filled with whispers and snickers, had gone quiet. The jury shifted in their seats, suddenly more attentive. The judge, once amused by what he thought was a foolish display of arrogance from a teenager, was now studying Nate Carter with an unreadable expression. Across the room, Prosecutor Cameron Reeves cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and adjusted his stance as if realigning himself for battle. But the shift had already happened. The moment of hesitation, the pause before his response, it was enough. Nate had seen it. The jury had seen it. And most importantly, Judge Monroe had seen it. Nate took a measured step forward, hands clasped behind his back, exuding a confidence that made it seem like he belonged at the prosecution's table, not the defendants. "While we wait for the GPS logs," Reeves said, regaining his composure, "let's not forget the fact that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. That, Your Honor, is indisputable. A reasonable argument. A lifeline for the prosecution." Nate gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "That's true," he admitted. "My fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Judge Monroe raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to continue. Nate turned, making direct eye contact with the jurors. He had studied human psychology as much as he had studied law. He knew that engaging the jury was key. If he could make them feel like part of the conversation rather than passive observers, he could shift the way they viewed the case. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my fingerprints on the steering wheel mean I stole the car," Nate said, his voice calm, controlled. "That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically for a moment." He let the silence stretch for just a beat longer than necessary, enough to make people lean in. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You slip your hands into the pockets, zip it up, then put it back on the rack and leave. Later that night, someone shoplifts that exact jacket. If your fingerprints are found on it, does that mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery murmured under their breath. Nate didn't give them time to recover. "The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft," he continued. "I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything from inside. It was a dumb moment of curiosity." He turned back to the jury, letting his words sink in. "But does touching something make you a criminal?" Reeves shifted, flipping through his notes as if searching for something to counter Nate's argument. "Your Honor," Nate said, redirecting his attention to the judge, "let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was conducted. Was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Judge Monroe blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Reeves. The prosecutor hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he admitted, "No." Nate pressed his lips together, as if that was all he needed to hear. "So let me get this straight," he said. looking between the judge and the jury. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me. But they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine. No opportunity to ask about the chain of custody or challenge the accuracy of the analysis. Reeves' jaw tightened. Nate tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. Interesting? Judge Monroe exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was beginning to realize that this case wasn't the open and shut conviction he had expected. But Nate wasn't done yet. Your Honor, he said, stepping toward the defense table. I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. The room shifted again. Judge Monroe frowned. The owner? Nate nodded. Yes. Your Honor. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Tesla, provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. His gaze flickered to Reeves. And I think I know why. Reeves stiffened. Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen? Nate asked, his voice casual but laced with challenge. Reeves knew exactly what was coming. But Nate didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file, unfolded it, and read aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid. And he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Nate held the paper up for effect. This is from the original police report, he said, his voice sharp. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Monroe. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Reeves took a step forward, scrambling. Your Honor. This is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. Nate shook his head. No. I wasn't. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, Nate said. Walking home after getting snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Judge Monroe let out a slow breath. The case was unraveling fast. And everyone knew it. Nate turned back to the jury. The real suspect got away that night, he said, his voice steady. The officers found a black kid in the same general area, and decided that was close enough. He paused, letting the words settle in. That's what this case is really about. Silence. Judge Monroe adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Does the prosecution have anything further? Reeves stood rigid, his face slightly flushed. He glanced down at his notes, then at the jury, and finally at the judge. His confidence was gone. He knew he had lost. No. Your Honor. Judge Monroe exhaled, then looked at Nate for a long time before glancing at the jury. Then, finally, he leaned forward. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence. Then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, some in quiet relief. The gallery stirred. Reporters scribbling in their notebooks. Nate didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. Let the reality sink in for everyone. Judge Monroe still gripped his gavel, his face unreadable. But there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Maybe even regret. Nate met his gaze. Then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Carter." Nate stopped but didn't turn. Judge Monroe hesitated. Then finally said, "You should consider law school." Nate smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. As Nate Carter stepped out of the courtroom, the cool afternoon air hit him like a wave of relief. The tension of the trial, the weight of the stairs, the relentless scrutiny, it all seemed to dissolve into the Los Angeles skyline. But the moment of peace didn't last long. A swarm of reporters was already waiting on the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing like lightning strikes. Microphones were thrust toward him, voices overlapping in an attempt to be the first to get his reaction. "Nate, did you expect the judge to dismiss the case? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? What are your next steps? Will you pursue law school?" Nate ignored the noise, pulling his hoodie over his head as he descended the steps. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was never about that. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Evelyn Carter, stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him, taking in the reality of what had just happened. Finally, she shook her head and exhaled. "Boy, you scared me half to death," Nate chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk." "Ma." She stared at him for another second, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." Around them, the world kept moving, the reporters, the passers-by, the people who had just witnessed something extraordinary but would soon move on to the next big story. But across the street, standing near his car, Judge Monroe lingered. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't one of amusement anymore, it was something else. Reflection. Maybe regret. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another defendant. Just another guilty plea. But now, he knew he'd remember this one. Because Nate had done something most people never could. He had made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. Back at home, Nate sat at the kitchen table, his fingers drumming against the wood. His mother sat across from him, watching him carefully. "You gonna tell me how you pulled that off?" she finally asked. Nate smirked. "You always told me to pay attention to the details." Evelyn shook her head. But there was pride in her eyes. "Details don't always save you, Nate. You were lucky." "I was prepared," she sighed. "And what if you weren't? What if the judge had ruled differently? What if the jury had ignored everything you said?" Nate leaned back in his chair. "Then I'd be another statistic." His mother's lips pressed together. She didn't have to say anything. They both knew the truth. The system wasn't built to give kids like him a fair shot. This time, he had won. But how many others hadn't? How many people had been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias? Because of shortcuts? Because the system cared more about closing cases than finding the truth? Nate had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? The ones who couldn't? He looked at his mother. "This isn't the last courtroom I'll stand in." She raised an eyebrow. "You saying what I think you're saying?" Nate nodded. "The next time I walk into a courtroom," he said, "I won't be the defendant." His mother exhaled, slowly, nodding. There was nothing else to say. because they both knew exactly what he was going to do next. The Westwood University Law Library was nearly empty, save for a few late-night students buried in their books. The weight of ambition and exhaustion filled the air. At a corner table, Nate sat with a stack of law books beside him, highlighter in hand. He had already aced his first year's classes, already caught the attention of professors who couldn't believe he had never taken a formal law course before. But this wasn't about grades. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. This was about making sure that next time it wasn't just him. That next time, someone else would have a fighting chance. And when that day came, he'd be ready. The hum of the library's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Nate flipped through the pages of criminal procedure, cases and materials. His highlighter hovered above a paragraph detailing the systematic flaws in witness testimony. But his mind was elsewhere. It had been a year since the trial that changed his life. A year since he had stood in a courtroom and dismantled a case built on weak evidence and assumptions. He had walked out a free man. But the echoes of that experience never left him. The justice system wasn't broken by accident, it was designed this way. And if it could almost take him down, what happened to the people who weren't prepared? The ones without the knowledge. The ones without the confidence to challenge it. He tapped his pen against the table, deep in thought. "Earth to Nate." A voice interrupted. He looked up to see Maya Jordan grinning at him from across the table. She was one of the few people he had befriended in law school. Someone who had grown up on the same side of town as him. Who understood the stakes. "You look like you're about to go to war," she said, setting her books down. "Maybe I am," Nate muttered, flipping a page. Maya raised an eyebrow. "You mean in a mock trial? Because I heard they're picking teams for next semester's competition." Nate smirked. "Mock trial isn't my battlefield." "Then what is?" He exhaled. "The real thing." Maya leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You're really doing this? Ha! Not just getting a law degree, but actually taking the fight to the system. That's the plan." She shook her head, impressed. "You're insane. You know that. That's what they keep telling me." Maya hesitated before leaning forward. "If you're serious about this, you're going to need allies." Nate set his pen down. "You volunteering?" She grinned. "Depends. Are you paying?" He laughed. "You know I'm broke? Then I guess we're fighting the system for free." She extended a fist. And Nate bumped it without hesitation. It was a small moment, but one that solidified something important. He wasn't in this alone. A few months later, Nate found himself standing in front of a judge again. Only this time, he wasn't the one on trial. "Your Honor, my client was unlawfully searched. The police report itself contradicts the officer's statements. And the bodycam footage, Mr. Carter." The judge interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "This is a preliminary hearing, not a lecture on constitutional rights." Nate didn't flinch. Respectfully, "Your Honor, the Constitution applies at all hearings." The prosecutor scoffed, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is a simple possession charge. The defense is overcomplicating things." Nate turned to him. "Overcomplicating? You mean holding the police accountable for violating my client's Fourth Amendment rights?" The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "Here we go again." Nate thought. He had learned early that the fight wasn't just about knowing the law. It was about how willing the people in power were to listen. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, "I assume you're requesting the suppression of the evidence." Yes, Your Honor, Nate replied. And I'd also like to remind the court that failing to do so would set a dangerous precedent. The prosecutor folded his arms. And what precedent is that? Nate turned to the jury box. Even though there was no jury today, it was a habit now. He spoke to the people, not just the judge. The precedent that police misconduct doesn't matter as long as they get what they want. The judge gave him a long, tired look before finally sighing. I'll review the body cam footage. We'll reconvene next week. That was as close to a win as Nate was going to get today. As he left the courtroom, Maya was waiting for him in the hallway. Well? She asked. Nate smirked. They blinked first. She grinned. Then let's keep making them blink. It started with one case. Then another. Soon? Nate wasn't just representing clients. He was teaching them. He started holding free legal workshops at the community center, breaking down complex legal concepts in a way that people could understand. He showed them how to protect their rights, how to navigate the system, how to push back when the system tried to steamroll them. Word spread. Young men and women, many who had been written off by society, started showing up, hungry to learn. Some had been in situations like Nate's. Some had family members who had been. And some, like Maya, were just ready to fight. One night, as he was packing up, an older man approached him. You really think you can change things, kid? The man asked. Nate looked him in the eye. I know I can. The man chuckled. Then keep going. And so he did. Because he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for all of them. The courtroom was packed. Not with just the usual legal professionals, but with members of the community, young law students, and reporters who had followed Nate Carter's rise from a once wrongly accused teen to one of the most talked about defense attorneys in the city. This wasn't just another case. This was the case. The one that could change everything. At the center of it was Darius Miller, a 22-year-old accused of armed robbery. The prosecution had built its case on weak witness testimonies, circumstantial evidence, and a complete disregard for due process. It was the kind of case that usually ended in a guilty verdict, because public defenders were overworked. Jurors assumed guilt. And no one cared enough to challenge the system. But Nate Carter was not a public defender. And he was not afraid. Judge Raymond Monroe, the same judge who had once smirked down at Nate in his own trial years ago, sat at the bench. But today, there was no smirk. There was only quiet observation. The prosecutor, an older man with decades of experience, stood with his hands behind his back. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence is clear. The defendant was identified at the scene of the crime by multiple witnesses. He was arrested just blocks away. The state intends to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he is guilty. Nate let the words settle in the room. Then he stood. Your Honor, he began. Before we let the prosecution continue spinning their narrative, I'd like to remind the court that what we are dealing with is a story built on assumptions, not facts. Judge Monroe glanced at him. You may proceed, Mr. Carter. Nate walked toward the jury, his hands in his pockets. He had mastered this move, the pause before speaking. The way he let silence work in his favor. Multiple witnesses, he said. That sounds impressive, doesn't it? He nodded toward the prosecutor. That's what they want you to think. That if enough people say something, it must be true. Then he pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase. But what if I told you these witnesses gave wildly different descriptions of the suspect? One says he was wearing a blue hoodie. Another says red. One claims he had a tattoo on his arm. The other says no tattoos at all. He turned to the jury. His voice steady. If the prosecution's case is built on eyewitness testimony, then we have a serious problem. The prosecutor adjusted his tie. Clearly irritated. Mr. Carter, are you suggesting that all these witnesses are lying? Nate shook his head. Not lying. Just wrong. Studies have shown that human memory is unreliable, especially in high-stress situations. And let's not forget, he turned to the jury again, Darius Miller wasn't arrested at the scene. He was arrested blocks away. No stolen goods. No weapon. Just a young black man walking home. The weight of that sentence hung in the air. Nate saw some of the jurors shift in their seats. He had them. By the time the trial neared its end, the prosecution had started to stumble. Nate had shredded their case. Piece by piece. The fingerprint evidence. Inconclusive. The so-called eyewitnesses. Unreliable. The detective's report. Riddled with inconsistencies. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. And most importantly, the city saw it. This case wasn't just about Darius Miller anymore. It was about all the young men who had been railroaded by a system that cared more about convictions than justice. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. The foreperson stood, cleared her throat, and spoke the words Nate had worked so hard to hear. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Darius broke down in tears. His family sobbed. And Nate. He just closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. Because this wasn't just a win for Darius. This was a win for everyone who had ever been told they didn't stand a chance. Outside the courthouse, the press was waiting. Nate, how does it feel to win the most important case of your career? Do you think this verdict will set a precedent for future cases? What's next for you? Nate adjusted his tie and looked out at the sea of cameras. Flashing lights. And hopeful faces in the crowd. For the first time, he didn't feel like the kid who had once stood in front of a judge, terrified and alone. He felt like the man who was going to change everything. He turned to Maya, who stood beside him, her arms crossed. What do you think? He asked. Did we just shake the system? She smirked. I think we cracked it wide open. Nate nodded. Because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. How do you feel about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback to improve even more. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our latest videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.